Chishti.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. The question to Chief Constable Thornton. With regards to pressures and resources, of course, one understands the ability to do what one can is linked to resources. In 2010, nationally, what was the overall figure for police reserves?
2010, I haven't got the figure. I'm aware that in 2015 it was 22% revenue. Let me just get this.
Can I give you a figure and see if it's correct? The figure which I have, it's in 2010-11, we're talking about 1.4 billion, and 2016, we're talking about 1.66 billion. Would that seem to be around the right figure overall?
Okay, so we need to be really careful with reserves.
Yeah.
The current figure for March 2017 for total reserves, that includes general reserves, earmark reserves and capital reserves, was 2.1 billion.
Yeah.
And that is planned to reduce by 60% over the next 3 years. In terms of the revenue reserves, which currently stand at 1.6, we know that since 2015 they have gone down by 22%, which is exactly what Forces said when the NAO did the report back in 2015. We said that there was a plan to spend earmark reserves. That's been happening. A fifth have gone in the last 2 years, and we suggest that 60% will go over the next 3 years. So there is a general profile of spending reserves. I think I and all my colleagues are absolutely of the view that we shouldn't be hoarding money, that this is money that should be spent on ongoing services. And as you can see from the figures, most forces over the last couple of years have spent reserves on services, and they plan to do so over the next 3 years.
Just clarification on that, and 1.4 billion in 2010 and 2011, 1.66 billion in 2016, and at the same time we get a statement to say funding is at tipping point, and your point about not hoarding money. So how do we get police forces to actually use the money and also to ensure that they should have been doing the right thing back from, say, 2010?
The last time that we had a look at this was 2015, and as I said, reserves have been spent at a rate of a fifth, i.e. 22% since then, and the plan is to go to 60%. I completely agree with you that we shouldn't be keeping these reserves, and as I say, most forces are spending them and plan to spend them over the next 3 years.
And just a final question, sorry.
If I perhaps illustrate from West Midlands perspective, I think it might be useful. So West Midlands has reserves currently around 106 million. So 27 million of those are in what's called a general reserve. They're against, so the force has to self-insure, so it needs about £10 million of reserve to self-insure. It has a level of reserves that's audited to the state, and then there's a level of reserve in there allocated on uniform equipment, vehicle replacements, kind of standard level. The level of capital that's been coming into forces has been reducing over a number of years in policing. If you then look for the types of programmes forces are doing to lever savings have changed much over the last 7 years. So, early on you change your processes, you make some choices. Now a lot of the change is quite technology driven, and it's one of the pressures I think that will emerge on public services in general over the next few years, isn't it? We're moving from a phase where actually we're not spending as much perhaps on resources in terms of people, more on technology. So if you look, we've got about £1 million provisioned against risk on our budgets because we've got capital programmes that move between years. We've got in the region of about kind of 12-13 million pounds in there that's spent against capital programmes. We've got a significant amount of money against the state, but actually of that money about £28 million is in the revenue budget this year supporting spending. So there's about 18 million in this year. We'll make a similar level depending upon where our position is at the end of the year that's actually in revenue now.
Just clarification on that. Say for example, if money had been used from that reserve pot from 2010, say the 1.4 billion and then the 1.66 that you've got at the moment, does that then mean if money had been used, resources from that pot of money which the police had, then that would have had an effect in relation to the level of crime that could have been prevented?
Well, in terms of resources available, the balance I think people are trying to do with the reserves is we are using some to support revenue spending, so I'm using 18 million this year in the revenue budget to prop up the £524 million to keep resource numbers up. So if course that's important, but of course the plan can't be to do that. So I'm also spending a significant amount of technology to actually enable me to manage with fewer people in that space. So I think people have made choices when they phased reserves in over a period of time. I agree with the points that Sarah's making, that actually, reserves are for a rainy day. It feels like it's raining quite hard at the moment, and so we need to be spending the money. But that money has to be it's kind of one moment. So actually, in terms of technology, in terms of estate changes that free up money from revenue, in terms of resources and revenue, there's a choice across that spread. And I think really from 2015 we've seen that acceleration, just as we told the National Audit Office would happen. I think people were initially told that austerity period would probably be about 5 years, and people probably might wisely made some assumptions they may need reserves later in the period.
Just a final question to Chief Constable Morgan. You mentioned earlier in terms of the increase in gun crime and knife crime, and we've also looked at the issue of resources. I just had figures and stats quoted to me by the regional media in Kent about the increase of knife crime like the rest of the country. What extra resources do you need to address the issue of knife crime, both in your point earlier about responding and also resolving the issue of knife crime?
So, I'm wary of drawing correlations between resources and crime figures, because at different times in history they've been in different places. My interest is in having the resource to deal with issues and prevent them. I don't think there's necessarily much time for the correlation. The issue around knife crime, my own force is seeing the same rise as other areas are. I think you can't arrest your way out of a knife crime issue, so that's about an engagement with young people in particular who are arming themselves in fear of knife crime, and therefore promulgating it themselves. That's education, that's youth engagement, that is a role for policing to play. It does involve stop and search, that's been already touched upon in terms of a tactic. It needs intelligence-driven objectives, and it needs punishment for those who are carrying weapons and causing life-changing injuries. So that is a true partnership problem that needs resolving with partners, and in large parts of the country is working across the piece. I've done the same over the summer with a knife amnesty. Hundreds of knives being taken off the streets by young people coming forward, so it's got to be sustained in those terms. We're doing that work, we're doing it with our partners. Of course we'd want to do more.
Just looking at the nature and scale of the issue that we have across the country, how many would you say overall individuals we have who are either under investigation, under observation, and also take into account the figure of 800 which have gone to approximately a dash. So overall across the country, what is the overall number we're looking at which will give us an indication of the nature and the scale of this issue?
So we have well over 3,000 people that we are investigating between ourselves and the security service, subjects of interest as we refer to them. But then there's a sort of wider penumbra of problem that, so you'll have heard us speak about before, over 20,000 people who previously touched investigations and aren't currently under live investigation. And indeed, some of the attacks we've seen this year have come from people in that cohort who, years ago, we were pretty clear, and I think right at the time, that they were not criminally or terrorist active, even though they had unsavoury friends and unsavoury views. And subsequently, years later, they become more active and committed an attack. Yeah. So 3,000 and 20,000 are good numbers to work with.
And looking at 3,000 and 20,000, and if one can just break it down into the category of dangerous, disillusioned and disturbed. In that category, just looking at how people get sucked into this poison, evil ideology, but out of that 23,000, how many would you say are going in the category of clearly dangerous, clearly disillusioned and disturbed?
So in the 20,000 there's a whole range of characteristics in there. I wouldn't try and analyse it. In the 3,000 I can't pull a number on that out of my head, but there's a lot of people with mental health issues, there's a lot of young vulnerable people in there, and there are some very clear thinking, determined and very dangerous individuals. There's the whole combination there. If I look at across these 12, I mentioned 12 potential attacks this year, 7 foiled, 5 successful. In there you've got people being directed from overseas and people just inspired by the propaganda. You've got adults and children, you've got boys and girls, men and women, you've got people connected into ISIS, people connected into Al-Qaeda, you've got very clear thinking, very bright people, and you've got sort of vulnerable people with either mental health or issues, or sort of vulnerable by matter of age. So the spectrum is enormous. It's such a diverse picture.
Well, that's the question I raised, because if the spectrum is so diverse, then you need a different approach to deal with the different elements that you have. If they're dangerous, you've got to have a different strategy to deal with that. If they are disillusioned, you have a different strategy to deal with that. If they're disturbed mental health issues, you have a different approach to deal with that. Of the 3,000 we have, roughly, what would you say you would place down in clearly dangerous, and say those who are disturbed and need mental health support?
Approximately. They're on the list because they're all potentially dangerous. Just because you're disturbed doesn't mean you're not potentially dangerous. I can't sort of subdivide that up, but you're right about different strategies. So some of the things we've been doing over the last 2 or 3 years as this picture has changed. So we've got a very different relationship with mental health service. We've got dedicated mental health teams working in 3 of the regions, helping coordinate work across the country, so that if someone comes into one of our operations who's got mental health challenges, looking at, do we deal with it as an enforcement issue or a health issue, for example. We've been increasingly doing safeguarding work with local councils. So at any one stage, there's been sort of many tens of children who are going through ward of court type proceedings because we're worried because their parents are radicalising them, or their parents aren't managing to look after them, and they've been radicalised elsewhere, and there's some sort of vulnerability towards them. So all the time there's new types of work going on in local partnerships to try and wrestle with this problem. What I think this summer teaches us is we're going to have to scale that to a scale way beyond what we've done previously. We're going to depend more on local policing, more on local council and social services. There's a lot more work we need to do in this territory, which, given the state of resourcing in those spaces, will take more resources to make it viable.
And just a couple of clarification points, 3 if I may. One, I completely get the dangerous. The point I was making was in relation to some, they don't have the disturbed element of mental health issues that are clearly bent on causing carnage. The differentiation I was trying to make on that. With regards to the 800 who have gone to fight with Daesh, from the information that you have, how many of them have been taken out as known targets, and how many of them do we know have are confirmed having lost in battle? That gives us an idea of the number we're looking at who may be coming back to this country.
So I'm not going to give out any more exact numbers. So I think we've said before, there's into 3 figures have been killed, and the rest of them, about half have come back and half have stayed there. The half who've stayed there so far are much more dangerous. They were much more committed to fighting, and they're much more determined. So it is still possible that most of them will die fighting, which, from a domestic perspective, I'm not against that as a prospect. But I think we have to expect some of them will come back. And as I said earlier, we've done everything we can do over the last 2 or 3 years since they travelled out there to build a case against them. So any of them we can put in prison, we will do. And if we can't, those will take labour-intensive operations.
And just finally, with regards to the social media aspect, of course we had a statement today with regards to Daesh being defeated in Iraq militarily. But the bigger argument on that is defeating the poison ideology, idea and appeal, and that goes across Europe, because it may be 800 from the United Kingdom have gone out there to fight with Daesh, but there are thousands from across Europe. So the argument in relation to how one addresses the issue of online recruitment, which is the biggest recruiting ground around Europe and internationally, is there a set strategy with all our European partners? For example, Germany is now introducing legislation for extremist material to be taken down within a certain period of time. They have the same problem that we have on online radicalisation. Is there a set standard procedure in relation to when that material should be taken down, so that all the 27 countries can work together to push those social media companies to do what they should be doing?
So the UK has led in that way. One of the units we run, the Counter-Terrorism Internet Referral Unit, which does that work with the companies in terms of identifying material that we want taken down. We were the first place in the world to do that, and sort of Europol have created a sort of parallel unit, and European countries are cooperating on that. So there is not a legal standard. As I said earlier, the companies are keen to clean up their sites because they recognise they should do, and I think most countries are working in this direction. The challenge is, though, there is so much material out there, and it only takes a small amount of it to get into the hands of the wrong people.
Christopher Chope.